on the date of 1942, initiated the Bracero Program because of farm labor shortages caused by American entry into World War II. The Bracero Program brought Mexican workers to replace American workers dislocated by the war. The program was intended to be temporary, but a growing dependence on American farms on Mexican labor kept it going for nearly 2 decades after the war ended. Mexican immigration has historically fluctuated with changing social and economic conditions in both the United States and Mexico. During periods of social unrest, violent uprisings, or bad economic times in Mexico, such as the Mexican Revolution, immigration increased. With the U.S. economy having a decline, Mexican immigration had decreased. On an excerpt from James Mills to Senator Carl T. Hayden, he states that it was highly important that our Mexican farm labor system was able to put a positive basis on to enable farmers in California and Arizona to plan this year's production and to make it possible for General Burton to go on to Mexico City immediately after the first of the year. Another excerpt from the Hayden papers stated that I am today addressing a letter to our Mexican border districts instructing them to proceed immediately with the insurance of such cards to persons who are illiterate but who are otherwise entitled to admission to the United States and to use of such cards. I believe you will want to see the enclosed copy of House Joint Resolution 96 as it is reported yesterday from the Senate Committee on Appropriations. This measure, as is now, stands effectively removing the Farm Security Administration from any direct contact with farmers who employ agricultural labor. However, Mexico has long been a source of cheap temporary labor for the United States. Indeed, until the establishment of the U.S. Border Patrol in 1924, the border between the United States and Mexico was virtually unsupervised. Citizens of both countries crossed it as they pleased, and farmers in the American Southwest recruited seasonal workers from Mexico without government interference or supervision. After the United States entered World War I in 1917, Mexican workers played an important role in keeping American agriculture productive. The Bracero program of the 1940s was essentially a more formal and more tightly supervised international agreement to provide an adequate labor force after World War II. However, despite the contributions the program made to American agriculture and to the American economy, it had many vocal critics in both countries. Truman's Commission on Migratory Labor in 1951 disclosed that the presence of Mexican workers depressed the income of American farmers, even as the U.S. Department of State urged a new Bracero program to counter the popularity of communism in Mexico. Furthermore, it was seen as a way for Mexico to be involved in the Allied armed forces. The first Braceros were admitted on September 27, 1942 for the sugar beet harvest season. From 1948 to 1964, the U.S. allowed it on average 200,000 Braceros per year. In an excerpt from Truman, he stated that the committee intended to lend moral support to the Zionist cause and encourage the settlement of large numbers of Jewish refugees in the Jewish national home. When fully organized, the committee will include many leaders in every walk of American life, public and private. 26 members of the Senate, including the majority and minority leaders, have already signified their approval and adherence. On an excerpt from Robert F. Wagner, he stated that he was elated that the committee had recommended admission to Palestine of 100,000 displaced Jews of Europe as soon as possible, and he had a certain key of principles towards the British White Paper of 1939 concerning Jewish immigration and land purchase. These advances, though delayed far too long, and were a tragic plight of the Jewish people in Europe to the extent that they are carried out promptly and with firmness. He also stated that he was grievously disappointed, however, in the committee's long-range recommendations as to the political future of Palestine. These latter recommendations appear completely at variance with the overwhelming American sentiment for the Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. The Jewish refugees were trying to escape from the camps, but in the end they couldn't. They were all put to death and trying to run from something they couldn't at all. Genocide. That's what it was. And it took hard, long tolls on families and on everyone. In earlier years, most children were not educated for long, or even at all. They had to be launched into adult world, working to provide for themselves and their families, or even fighting for their country. Without the interruption of a war, teenagers in this era were able to stay in school longer, and which gave them more opportunities to interact with others their age and express their thoughts and opinions. So this caused them to rebel against their parents. Teenagers in this era would have grown up constantly being told stories about the war and how lucky they are to have not experienced war yet. They were afraid of their parents' world. It was clear that the world had changed from a prospect of global annihilation. They saw an opportunity in directing which way the world moves toward. This is when teenagers realized that they were powerful enough to make a change. In the beginnings of the youth rebellion for women, they wore knee-length skirts that were very modest. They also favored the bouffant hairstyle. Mini skirts and hot pants became popular, usually paired with go-go boots. This was whenever girls were beginning to reveal their legs and showing off their curves as a way to, hey guys, parents, I don't care anymore. Ladies also had their hair really short or really long, never really in the middle. Ladies wore peasant skirts or granny dresses with chunky shoes. Unisex dressing was very popular, and many began wearing bell-bottom jeans and embellished t-shirts. For the men that rebelled, the gents usually had crew cuts, longer hair, and sported beards with facial hair. Men's clothes were also typically in bright colors. There wasn't usually anybody that didn't wear bright colors. By the end of the 1960s, ties were usually 5 inches wide in pattern. Most wore them all the time, even with pattern suits. During this era, technology was quickly advancing. Music became a very big influence, and rock and roll became very popular, which put up with kids rebelling against their parents day and night. Many listened to Elvis Presley for his unique mixed sound of country, bluegrass, and rock. Transistor radios also became very popular, as it allowed teenagers to carry their music everywhere with them. In conclusion, the teenagers that were part of the baby boom grew up with many opinions on the war. They protested against it, and the use of nuclear weapons. Many of the more significant events that happened during the Cold War were conflicts that arose on the topic of nuclear weapons. These kids voiced their opinions loud and clear to the adults that were still making decisions whether or not to keep using nuclear weapons. If these opinions were taken more seriously, we could have prevented more conflicts from arising.
Now, no matter what you think of rock and roll, I think you have to keep a nice open mind about what the young people go for. Otherwise, the youngsters won't feel that you understand them.
The rebellion of the 1960s was a time of social uproar in North America. During this era, America was facing many controversial issues including civil rights, the Vietnam War, nuclear arms, and nonconformity. This was also the time period when America was exploring space discovery and the man on the moon. Unhappy with the current political and cultural standards, American youth began to express their desire for freedom, peace, and love. Unwilling to conform, they demanded these rights, and so they began the rebellion. In the 1960s, music became the leading form of communication. You don't have to have an understanding of education or understand music, so it was perfect medium for rebels to target the government, express their opinions, and influence others through a song. In the end, World War II and the Cold War were very similar and different. From the Braceros coming into America and working for the Americans, to the Jewish refugees in a crisis from getting away from genocide and trying to save their families, to youth rebellion against kids trying to live their lives and not have their parents tell them what to do, and just the culture overall changing.